I was 19 years old the first time I returned to Africa. I still remember the smell and the taste of the air as I departed the plane. I was a young exchange student studying French and business management at Hampton University, a historically Black college in Southern Virginia. My French teacher encouraged me to study abroad as a way to strengthen my language skills. I envisioned lounging on the beaches of southern France and indulging in French wine. But she introduced the idea to me of studying in Africa instead of France, to my surprise. See, I was a student who had a lot of intentions of working in the fashion industry at the time. But Dr. Moore saw my passion for justice and sent me to my ancestral home. In Senegal, I witnessed absolute beauty and absolute poverty for the first time, and both looked like me. My dreams of fashion quickly faded, and I accepted my life's calling in the movement for Black liberation worldwide. 3 years later, I returned to the continent after completing my studies to work for a small international NGO based in Lofa County, Liberia, following the country's civil war. At that time, Lofa County had about 275,000 residents. I would often babysit for my next door neighbor and spend time with her, elders, and other women in the community, learning pre-colonial history, culture, religion, and so much more. It was there that I went through a reawakening, a rebirthing process. For the first time, I felt one with the land. It was so weird to feel at home to a place I never knew. At one of the many international NGO stakeholder meetings, someone was giving a report of all of the development assistance that had been dedicated to Lofa County for the year, and the number was huge, in the multi-millions. See, at that ripe age of 22, I mistakenly blurted out, "Where the hell did the money go?" Because when you looked around, Lofa was extremely depressed and underdeveloped, with a lack of basic infrastructure and economic opportunity. I said, "We'd been better off giving everyone $10,000 to see what they could do and flourish, as GDP was well below $5,000 a year for that community." I quickly realized that cash disbursements were deemed outlandish in development and was scolded and told, if we just hand out money, folks won't be self-reliant, they'll be more dependent. The thought of African women not being self-reliant was the biggest lie I'd ever heard almost. And quite frankly, reminded me of a similar lie in America about the Black welfare queen, both racist and untrue stereotypes. I quickly realized how racism and oppression in donor countries reflected and played out in international relations, global power, and international development. I realized the racism in this. And so for the next 15 years, I had the pleasure of unlearning lies, relearning truth, relearning history, and fighting to dismantle systems of oppression, learning from the elders and my African brethren, and becoming one with the land. I come from a strong line of powerful women. And I think that's important to know where I come from so you can know how I got to this point. When I was about 4 years old, my mother, sister, and I, we moved in with my grandmother for a few years, and we grew very close. I remember and reflect back on the times that I sit with her while she combed her hair, combed my hair, and painted her nails, and told me stories of our ancestors. She told me stories of her mother, my great-grandmother Lou, and my great-great-grandmother Mary Jane. See, Grandma Lou, she was a bad mama jamma. Around the turn of the century in Jim Crow South, she went from being a housekeeper for white families to a landowner, successful entrepreneur, continuously fighting racism and sexism in the Jim Crow South. My grandmother reminded me that I was only 4 generations removed from enslavement and only 1 generation removed from segregation, as my mother attended segregated schools until she was in the 7th grade. My mother and I graduated from the same high school, where only a few decades before, neither one of us were welcomed unless it was to cook or clean. But while the legal rules had changed, much else had not. As a teenager, I could still feel how very new this progress was. Years of systemic racism were very much alive every day. And it reminded me that so much more was needed. Over the years, I've been continuously reminded that I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors, with their footprints guiding me and their spirit running through me. Through my grandmother's love and her stories, she instilled in me a sense of power, pride, responsibility, and purpose. I come from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is a symbol of hope, of freedom, of people power, and a beacon for equality around the world. It is unquestionably the place where decisions affecting the world's 7 billion citizens are made. From the Capitol buildings to Embassy Row, hour by hour, minute by minute, every day international development is a topic of discussion here in DC. For me, DC is a beacon of freedom. But that freedom does not shine down from the huge colossal buildings or government offices. It comes from right here, from this actual community that I'm standing in today. It comes from the people. See, DC reminds me of Frederick Douglass, of Marvin Gaye, of Dr. Martin Luther King, who came here and stood on the steps of the Capitol, professed to the world that I have a dream. I've traveled around the world, but DC has been my home in more ways than one. This is my first political home. And what I mean by that is that this city has shaped and guided me to re-envision what empowerment of Black and brown people means. What it means for Black and brown people to be the drivers of the change that needs to happen in their communities, the change we want, the change we deserve. But right now there's a tension, a contradiction. Since the 1960s or so, DC has been dubbed Chocolate City due to the city's unique culture, music, flavor, and language, all infused from the large Black population. Since the 1960s, the Black population has hovered around 60% of the community, until now. Since 2000, the Black population has decreased more than 13% to only 47% of the city's population. 13% of Black DC has been displaced. And when you look at the outcomes for health, economics, and social, looking at the Black populations compared to the white population, the picture is completely different. White families have 81 times the wealth of Black families in the district. Black folks on average earn about 1/3 of the median income for white folks in the district. Years of racially discriminatory policies and practices in labor, housing, education, access to health care, and economic opportunity has resulted in the huge racial disparity that we have. Sometimes you can think of it as a tale of two cities. This same tension and contradiction I feel very much in development, where Black and brown countries have disproportionate health, economic, and social outcomes than predominantly Western white countries, and very little access to global markets. I've had to reconcile how I work in development, as I know that the problems we're trying to solve are inherently linked to the ways that racism and oppression have operated and guided decisions in my country and other donor countries around the world. And how allowing wealth to be concentrated for a few countries and poverty to be concentrated in other countries has led to this reality. How the exploitation of land and people for profit and wealth has led to this reality. So I've had to ask myself, what do I do and where do I go? All of this led me to believing in decolonizing development. And to decolonize development, I first had to start with decolonizing myself. Race is not real, it is man-made. Race was created around the 15 or 1600s during European colonial expansion to develop and maintain white skin access to power and privilege. We are 99% genetically alike. And science has proven that there's more variation within races than there is between races. Racism is a system. Racism is not a person, it's not an act. It's not doing something harmful to a person of color. It is a system. It is a system of advantage and oppression based on a way of organizing society where one race has domination and other races have subordination. Our current international and domestic power systems were built on race, where people of color, particularly Black people, were at the bottom. So much of our history involves the murder of indigenous people for their land, their wealth, and then forcing them into invisibility while atrocities against them continue. Enslavement made it okay to look at Black people and consider them 3/5 of man. And since then, this anti-Blackness has prevailed and has been hard to overcome. So when I think about decolonizing development, the first thing I do is ask myself, why are we here? Who's benefiting from what we're doing? Who's making decisions? Who has the power? Who are we accountable to? For the projects or programs that I may have been involved in, who has the decision making? Where are the majority of the resources going? Is it to the community or back to donor countries? So when I think about decolonizing development, I first had to understand what was colonization. Despite the global focus on race and racism at the moment, the development community has been very slow to acknowledge and or center race in our work. We've been very slow to openly discuss and recognize how colonization and enslavement and the trade of 20 million African bodies have directly led to the conditions we see today. After 20 years in one country, generation after generation of the same development programs, we have to ask ourselves, do we truly want to work ourselves out of a job and leave the community? Perhaps a mutual dependency has been created. It's very difficult to believe that we're working ourselves out of a job when most organizations have annual revenue and annual income growth goals. How do you work yourself out of a job if you're always trying to grow? I don't know who said this, but it's so true. Everyone gets paid to engage communities of color, except communities of color. If colonization is taking over one's land, forcing them to assimilate, then claiming it as your own, then decolonization must be the opposite of that. So where do we start? Let's start with what I call the 5 R's. 1, recognize. Recognize, understand, and quantify the damage and harm that has been done. Repair. Repair that harm through reparations. Restore. Restore land to pre-colonial times. Redistribute. Redistribute global power and resources. And my favorite, reimagine. Use your imagination to create the world that we all want to live in. Adrienne Maree Brown says that we're in an imagination battle, that the conditions as they are now are a direct result of someone else's imagination. And we need to imagine a way forward beyond those oppressive constructs. Conforming and maintaining systems of oppression and inequality only takes away our imagination, making us accept things as the way they are, instead of thinking about what they should be. And why am I hopeful that this is achievable? Because every social change has been led by those who have been oppressed. And last year, after the world witnessed the horrific murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, millions of people around the world, from DC to Joburg to Istanbul, proclaimed that Black Lives Matter in the largest civil rights movement in modern history. That my life matters. These global acts of solidarity, calling for an end of the current systems of inequality and exclusion, and for a new nation, a new world of equity, love, and justice. Because racism is a system maintained and created by people. And we, the people, have the power and the opportunity, while the world is watching, waiting, and ready to dismantle the current system and create the one that should be. Now, I know that can seem hard, and it can seem big, and it can seem challenging, especially for one person. But remember that you're not alone, that you're united with millions of activists around the world in solidarity. And that you just take it one step at a time, because change is ultimately the culmination of many small acts done over and over and over by a lot of people. So it starts with you. If I have to leave you with anything today, let it be this. Neuroscience has proven that the brain has the ability to learn and unlearn, to mend and heal multiple times. There's nothing stopping us. That ending racial inequality and racism is not taking something from white people. It's actually giving something to white people. It's giving them your freedom and your equity back. It's allowing the privileges and resources that you have to be shared with everyone else. It's to operate with compassion and love instead of competition and hate. My lessons of what's right, what's just, and how we should treat each other were learned at my grandmother's table. She taught me about healing, solidarity, mutual aid, and resiliency of Black and brown communities. What I learned from my time in Africa and around my grandmother's table is that the work for freedom and liberation for Black people started long before me and will continue after me. But that my responsibility while I'm here on this earth is to use my power and privilege to continue the fight. Thank you.